I'm talking about Vietnam, but before I do, I just wanted to make you think a little bit wider in your scope of history. So we've got the pyramids there, which we think are probably about 4,500 years old. Next to that, to the right, is an ancient part of a Roman city underneath Jerusalem, which is about 2,000 years old. It's amazing that it's so well preserved. Over on the left there, we've got the Colosseum, again about 2,000 years old. Stonehenge, who knows, probably somewhere in the region of 6,000 years old as it stands now, but possibly stuff there even older. And then on the top right there, we've got the remains of Jericho, one of the oldest sites left on the planet, which is around about 10,000 years old. Generally speaking, when we look at human history and we talk about the Holocene, we're talking about 10,000 years of history. And so all of that fits nicely within there. But what I want to start off with is that maybe there's a little bit missing, and maybe Vietnam is an important part of that. So I'm going to actually over here, if we talk about climate change, this is, roughly speaking, the current climate increase of the last 150 years. It's about 2.5 or 3 degrees Celsius in that time, which is really significant. And it's a steep curve, and it's not really something that we've seen within the last 10,000 years. But if you go a little bit further back than 10,000 years to here, we've got the period which is called the Younger Dryas. And within the Younger Dryas period, world temperatures changed by about 10 degrees within 100 years, which is just colossal. And so the effect that had on the planet was enormous. And it's not really a coincidence that we put history within this 10,000 year time frame. It's because it starts here. And the period immediately before it, as we're coming out of an ice age, is just catastrophic for planet Earth. And it totally changes everything about the Earth. So, for instance, 14,000 years ago, New York, London, they are underneath ice sheets which are 3 kilometers thick. And this is at a time when people did live, people the same as us today. Modern humans have been roughly what they are today for about 50,000 years, give or take. So, before that event, before that massive climate change event, we didn't really know what humans were doing, and we didn't know how advanced they were until recently. And we found this site. It's called Göbekli Tepe. It's in southern Turkey, and it dates back 12,000 years. This is the oldest building we've ever found, and it's the oldest religious building we've ever found by a long, long margin. If you think about the Great Pyramids as being 4,500 years old, this is almost 3 times as old as that. These giant stone pillars are maybe 5 to 10 tons each, and they were moved on top of this great big hill in various stages. You can see the circular formation, you can see the carving on the stonework. And so all of a sudden, really within the last 20 years or so, or the last 15, we've started to recognize that human civilization and human beings were really quite advanced before this great climate change event. And maybe there's more evidence out there of advanced human civilization before that time that we just don't really know about yet. And so when I think about Vietnam, and I think about this amazing change in the climate 10,000 years ago, I also think about the sea level change. So 14,000 years ago, the sea level across the world was about 100 or 120 meters lower than it is today. And what that meant was, in Sundaland, which is Vietnam, Malaysia, this whole Southeast Asian region, as the sea level was so much lower, there was a land bridge connecting it all. It was all one great big continental mass called Sundaland. And you see how it starts to change from the Younger Dryas period, 11,000 years before present, on and on and on, until about 4,000 years ago when it stops. And it looks kind of like what it looks like today. And so in terms of really, really ancient history for Vietnam, it tells us that actually there's probably a lot of stuff out there to be discovered that we just won't find because it's under the sea. It could be 50 or 60 meters below sea level. And I know some of you like to dive, but actually because of the way sea levels change so substantially, we would have to go really, really far out to see certain, if there are, let's say there's some kind of stone circle remains, it could be right in the middle of this Sunderland landmass, and who's going to find it? It's not really going to be there. And even right along the coast of Vietnam, we're talking about maybe 100 meters further out is where the coast would have been 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. And so I think there's maybe a part of Vietnamese history that we just don't know yet. Maybe there's going to be a more ancient culture that we just don't know about. Maybe there's some kind of Stone Age, stone circle type, Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe thing out there. And I hope one day it's students like ours who start to explore these new subjects maybe will be the people who find this missing evidence. I would hope so. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff we don't know about Vietnam, but what we do know is that until about 14,000 years ago, the whole thing really is a dense forest. So dense that people can't really live there. And so the areas that would be touched are in the south and in the north, around the Mekong Delta and the Red River Delta. The population of Vietnam at this time is probably only several thousand. People within one family unit wouldn't see anyone from another family unit maybe their whole life. It would be that sparsely populated. And larger populations of humans did exist at this time. We know around Indonesia, a place called Gunung Padang, there's a great big Stone Age Neolithic monument where we think maybe thousands of people lived around there. And this is at a time when this whole Sunderland region was connected. So Vietnam, a little bit off the map at this point. But who knows? I think maybe there's stuff out there that we just haven't found yet. What I can say is that histories of Vietnam tend to be about the kin or Viet people, who are the northern people. And I'm going to talk to you about 3 different major groups who make up Vietnam. And largely speaking, 2 of those groups are completely left out of the history books. Certainly the school textbooks, certainly the mainstream Vietnamese history that's published by the government and most of the academics. It's going to be about an ethno-history rather than a geographic history. In the UK, our history books tend to be geographic. We talk about the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons coming in. The Vietnamese are talking about the Vietnamese people. So, yes. Here we go. If you were to look at the Vietnamese textbook, they're going to say a couple of things. Number one, they're going to say that Vietnam's history begins with the Hung kings, these mythical kings who established their kingdom around about 5,000 years ago, 2,879 BC, I think they say. We don't really have a lot of evidence for that, and we don't really think they existed in the way that story's told. We're not sure they existed at all. In fact, what we've come to learn is that Vietnamese history doesn't begin in the north. The history of the geography of this land tells us that it begins in the south, and it begins not too far away from where we are right now. So over on the map here, I've got Ho Chi Minh City. Ho Chi Minh City here, and then this region here called An Son. So excavations which took place there from the end of the 1970s and through until the present day have gone progressively deeper and deeper and deeper until we've got to a point now where we've discovered remains which are around about 5,000 years old. And the really extraordinary thing about what we found is that it marks the transition between nomadic hunter-gatherer people and some of the first agriculture in the world. We found grains of rice which have been brought from China down into Vietnam. Rice agriculture begins around Quang Huy, the Yellow River, probably 7 8,000 years ago. Vietnam, 2,000 years later, that rice has worked its way down and farming begins. But because of the way archaeology works, between the different layers, the further down we go, we see the older remains, and we actually see the transition from people who basically hunted some fish, moved around, probably lived part of the year in this area and part of the year somewhere else, to people who had built a great big mound, about 170 meters in diameter, established a huge settlement, domesticated dogs and pigs for the first time in Vietnam, and started to grow rice. And so when you look at the textbooks and it talks about the Hun Kings and the northern area, they've totally neglected the fact that this is probably the most significant area in Vietnam. There are very few places on the planet where we can see so clearly that transition from hunter-gatherer nomadic people to settled agricultural communities. And then along with that comes pottery. We found pottery in other parts of Vietnam which we think might even be up to 8,000 years old. But it's not in the north, it's all in the south. And so really there needs to be a bit of a pivot in Vietnamese history to consider just how important the south was rather than the north. So, the people in the north and the south, they are one common ethnic group and they share a common root language. And we call them the Austroasiatics. And we think that they probably moved in from around southern China and they followed the river down, the Lancang, the Mekong River, all the way down. So all of the people who live around Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the main population groups, the main language groups, they have a shared common language, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 years back. They're all Austroasiatics. The other group are the Austronesians. So these people start off somewhere in Taiwan, perhaps, around about 4,000 years ago, perhaps, we can't know for sure. This is all based on linguistic studies, trying to follow the origin and the roots of the language. And we think that eventually, these are the people, by the way, who spread to Easter Island, New Zealand. We think that they probably went into Borneo, and then around about 3,000 years ago, they moved onto the coast of Vietnam in the middle, around Hue, Da Nang, that area. And so now, we've got these real two distinct ethnic groups, the Austronesians and the Austroasiatics. And we've got another distinction between the Austroasiatics in the south of the country and the Austroasiatics in the north of the country. Really quite distinct in language as well. They start to really divide. In the north, the Viet Kinh people start to come together. Their language starts to take shape. And from 111 BCE, China has established dominion over that area. This is part of the Han Chinese Empire. And it's the beginning of 1,000 years, basically, of Sinification, the influence of Chinese culture, language, and traditions. There are notable revolts. Hai Ba Chung, some of you might have heard of. The two sisters riding at the battle on elephants, really ferocious warriors. There's quite a lot of this hidden away. There's some really fantastic nationalistic stories about how Vietnam tried to fight for independence. And in the south, the same Austroasiatic ethnicity starts to merge into something else. So this area here, An Son, we know that it shares, or we think we know, that essentially we get what we could describe as a common market emerging across the south of Southeast Asia, all the way across Cambodia, Thailand, based on pottery and the trading of fish. And we think that those trade routes are connected by rivers, but also all the way along the coast. And so it's probably not really an accident that this area here, which eventually becomes known as Funan, a collection of city-states, not really one great big empire, would become the Khmer Empire. They share a common language eventually. Right now, we think they're a common market. So the north is dominated by China. The south seems to have this common market of trade based on fishing and pottery. Even from this point, Saigon is a part of that southern distinct area. It's growing in wealth. It's known to Chinese merchants. It's quite distinct and it's quite interesting. And by the way, there's a lot of remains from this civilization, this Funan civilization, all around the Mekong area, just outside of the city. Well worth a visit if you ever get a chance. In the middle of the country, we've got the Sa Huin, these Austronesian people, sandwiched between what really are two great big empires. And they don't know where to go. Whose sphere of influence are they going to fall under? Are they going to fall under the Chinese? Or are they going to fall under the Southerners? To begin with, the Chinese hold sway. They follow the Chinese. And then from about 200 CE or AD, they start to break away and they start to switch towards the Southerners. And it suggests that the regional power at this time actually is not the North, but it's the South. This group of people start to move into their sphere of influence. Maybe the South is more important than the North. What's interesting about these groups is they buried their dead in these great big vertical pots. We don't know why, but what we do know from that is they were possibly religious, probably spiritual, to take the time and the effort to bury not only their people in such a sophisticated way, but also to bury with them some really, really complex jewelry, really impressive jewelry, in fact. And you can see lots of this in Hoi An. The museum's right by the Japanese bridge, and all of this is on display. It's really quite nice. So these are the Austronesians. Sorry, the Austronesians. And then this is when things really start to change. We get this migration of ideas out of the Indian subcontinent, basically following the ideas in the Vedas. So the Vedas is the book of what most people might say is Hinduism, but it's a lot more complex than that. And the ideas in the Vedas, I think, are probably the oldest recorded ideas in humanity. I think they originally start out as an oral tradition passed down through a system of chants, which then eventually become written down about 3,500 years ago, and then from out of India, they spread all the way across Southeast Asia, following merchants and following trade. And so this whole southern area around here takes on the language of the scholars of India, Sanskrit, and it takes on its customs and ideas. And so now, not only have we got this area called Funan becoming Indianized, we've also got the area here where the Austronesians were, the Sa Huin, also becoming Indianized, switching away from the Chinese sphere in the north to the Indian sphere, in the south. And so roughly, this is what we would say. We would say for about the 1st century, you've got this area called Funan, which at various times is known as Chenla, Chenlop. There's a little bit of switching around there. It's a bit more complicated than this. But by the 8th century, this is the Khmer Empire. And in the center of the country, the Sa Huin, from around about 3,000 years ago, would eventually become known to the Chinese as Lam Op or Lin Yi. And finally, we would come to know them as Champa. Total massive generalization there, but that's as quick as I could do it. That's the summary. The Khmer Empire, as everybody knows, is this fantastic regional power which is famous for Angkor Wat, which starts from around about 1,000 years ago, probably the biggest city in the world in history up until London overtakes it in 1801. When it gets a population of 1 million people. Before that, we think Angkor had a population of 1 million people around about 800 years ago. Substantial. I don't know of anything that compares in scale. We're finding more about this place all the time. Super genius, to be honest, that they could build these giant causeways perfectly aligned to true north. Great mystery. I can't really say a lot more on that, but fantastic. The Cham, in the middle of the country, are still closely connected to the Khmer in the south, but they have got their own identity. Like I'm sure most of you know, you've been to some of these Cham sites. Gavin and I did a little exploration to the first Cham capital city. It's just outside of Hue. Nothing's there anymore, really. The whole thing is fenced off, but broke in and found some stuff. So the Cham were distinct, and by 1600 years ago they built a capital city just outside of Hue. That was their remains. It's really cool that a lot of this stuff is still there, kind of untouched. And the Vietnamese government, I mean, yeah, they're limited in money and funding and with what they can do, but there's so much history outside of the Viet people that is just under the ground waiting to be explored and discovered. And it's quite exciting. My Son, I'm sure most of you have been there as well. You know, amazing. This is a site built over a 1,000-year period. The religious home of the Cham. Again, it shows how they are, even though they've taken on lots of the culture and the language and traditions from the Khmer and from India, they've very much got their own unique sense of identity, customs, practices, religion, which change over time. This one, just outside of Munich. A lot of people haven't been to this one. On your way to Munich, when you get off the train station, this is about halfway to Munich, worth a visit, really well preserved. And these are the different capital cities of the Cham at various times. And then, so we've got the southern Khmer people which control Saigon. In the middle we've got Champa, and in the north, it's actually kind of after all of those civilizations have reached their apogee that the north and the Vietnamese people will rise up. They call their capital Thang Long the Riding Dragon. It's quite impressive. It takes about 1,000 years for them to declare independence, and then this guy, Ngo Nguyen, from a family of local elites who are in cahoots with the ruling Chinese, really, he goes out to take his revenge because his father-in-law is killed, and he ends up taking over the whole country, the whole province, and he declares independence. Often you might notice this street name in Vietnam, Bac Dang. It's a river where lots of famous battles have been fought. Bac Dang. There's a period of civil war, and then Dinh Bo Linh unites the country as the first real emperor and creates the capital city at Ninh Binh. Most of which is there, some of which has been adapted and changed, but it's still an impressive site. And you can see why they would have built it there, because it's surrounded by mountains, it's secluded. This was a new state that was trying to maintain its independence, but it didn't take long before they moved to Hanoi, because this new state feels confident enough to start looking for more commercial opportunities. It wants to get a little bit richer. And so the citadel at Thang Long is built, only one part of which is still there. The French destroyed the rest when they came in to redesign the city of Hanoi. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and flee through this. The next stage of Vietnamese history, as they emerge, is basically threefold. First of all, there's intervention by the Chinese, then there's intervention by the French, and then there is intervention by the Americans. We know how that one ends, but hopefully I can give you a little bit more about the Chinese and the French. So firstly, the Mongol invasion. Before the Mongol invasion, the first one starts in 1258, the Vietnamese are not really expansionary. They're quite happy with their state as it exists. However, in order to fight off the Yuan-Mongol invasion, the Vietnamese state becomes very militarized. And as is often the case, when a state becomes very militarized, it can lead to war. And so the Vietnamese defeat off the Mongol invasion. At the same time, there are problems within Vietnam itself. There is a continuing civil war, and around about the year 1400, the Chinese are invited in. One part of the ruling government invites the Chinese in to come and take control. Some of the Vietnamese don't like that, and so this guy, Le Loi, the street Le Loi named after him, he leads a successful revolt against the Chinese, and he takes back the country, and he continues to militarize it and to prepare it for another war and to try and create a state. When I talk to you about the Hung Kings and the stories that came about the Hung Kings, that comes from this time. So Vietnam is just really starting to get on its own 2 feet. From this point, with all these soldiers hanging around, it's possibly inevitable that the Vietnamese start to move south. So the current historical view from the Vietnamese scholars is that the Cham start attacking the Vietnamese, who are a little bit stronger than them, and I'm not sure I fully accept that. But a war ensues, and the Vietnamese go and sack the Cham capital. They kill 60,000 Cham, take 30,000 prisoner, and they start to expand the state southwards. They are still increasingly militarized. However, worth pointing out, I think, that there is no real manifest destiny idea like you find in America. They're not desperate to get to the southern coast, the Vietnamese, but maybe they're just a little bit more willing to push their boundaries. Here we are, so now 150 years later, Ming to Qing, Chinese, we get this movement of Ming elites south, and so they move here and they establish Chelon, which is today District 5 and District 6 of Saigon. At that point, a completely different settlement. Saigon, as it is now, did not exist. That was the main place to be. There were some smaller ports further down the river, not much. This is largely Cantonese, and they call that settlement Tai Nguyen, which is where we think the name Saigon originates. I think it means, in China, it means Western settlement. Tai Nguyen? Yeah, Western settlement. And so now by 1650, Vietnam is taking shape, and it's a lot more like we would recognize it to be. But, technically speaking, this area here around Saigon is still controlled by the Khmer Kingdom, and the Cham still have these three small regions here. It's at this point that Europeans see Vietnamese people for the first time. The Boxer Codex, from a group of Spanish explorers coming out of Manila, they paint the people that they see. This is in 1590, and so these are two people from Haiphong. I think the Vietnamese hairstyle is quite distinctive. So yeah, that's quite interesting. The Cham people at the same time, a little bit further south. Again, noticeably different, I would say. And the Khmer people, again, noticeably different. I think this guy is supposed to represent a pirate. And it's around about this time that the French start to become more involved. So this guy, Alexander de Rhodes, he takes the new Vietnamese alphabet, Latinized alphabet, which is created by Portuguese missionaries, and he adds to it. And he creates the first translation, trilingual translation, a trilingual dictionary between French, Vietnamese, and Portuguese. Pretty impressive man. He goes back to Paris, and he starts telling everybody about Vietnam and its riches and what French could get from this and how we've got to save these people. He wants to evangelize them all. And so, for the first time, now Vietnam is really on the map for Europeans. And it's not just the French who start to arrive in Vietnam. The British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Americans at one point, they all move into Vietnam to try and take advantage of trade. None of them successfully. None of them successfully. The Vietnamese leadership don't really want foreigners to have too much of a role. Late 1700s, the Tay Son, who I call the first socialists. These people were real Robin Hoods. They took from the rich and they gave out to the poor. They took over the country and they established the Tay Son dynasty between three brothers. One by one they all died, and people aren't sure what's going to happen next. There's a history of fighting between the Vietnamese in the north and the Vietnamese in the central region about which ruling family will have control over Vietnam. And so by about 1790, people are actually starting to get a little bit itchy. What's going to happen next? Who's going to take control of the country when the next Tay Son brother dies? So, the traditional Nguyen lords who were based in Hue, well, one of them is called Nguyen An, now known as Gia Long, or Gia Long. And he decides that he's going to send some emissaries over to France, and he's going to ask the French for help. If you help me become king, I will give you preferential trade access to Vietnam. I'll let you have control of the port of Da Nang and the ancient port city at Hoi An, which by this point is started to fill up. It's not as significant as it was, but that area of Vietnam is still very economically viable. And so the French sign a treaty with Nguyen An called the Treaty of Versailles, 1787, where they promise to give him arms, political support, military support, and build him a couple of fortresses. And so they do. They build him the fortress at Saigon. And this is now when we start to get actual Saigon. This is District 1. And none of it's left anymore. Don't go out looking for it, you'll find none of it. But some of these streets are. So this here, this canal, that today is Win Hue Street. It was a canal. And this would have been District 4, over District 7, over here. And you can see lots of these streets were canals at the time. Some of them were natural rivers which were made canals and then covered over to become streets and walkways. Once Wenan had control of this fortress and the trade that was being delivered by the Chinese at Chelon, he then had a really good foothold from which to take over the rest of the country, which he does. And so by 1802, Wenan has got control of the country. He's given the French their preferential access and they're very, very happy. Within about 50 years, it all starts to break down. A new Vietnamese king decides he's not happy with this arrangement. He wants to get rid of the French, or he wants to sideline them so they don't have the same kind of power and control. The French aren't happy with this because at the same time, the British have been engaged in the Opium Wars, and the British have just secured access into China. They've got complete preferential trade access to enormous wealth. And so the French want part of the action. They think that if they take control of Hanoi, they can go up the Red River into China and gain access to it that way. And so for the first time, rather than just being something for preferential trade access, France starts to see Vietnam as a potential colonial possession. And they attempt to take control of the city of Da Nang. They take control of it for about a year. They're under siege and they give up. They come back with the help of the Spanish from the Philippines, and in 1858 they take over Saigon. This is a drawing from the siege of Saigon in 1858. They never lose control of it again until the Second World War. Opium Wars, yes. So this is what France wants. They want control the same way Britain has. From 1858, they really start to develop this city quickly because of its commercial opportunities. So in 1866, we've got this map here. You can start to see the development of these canal systems. All of these canals, like here, are leading to markets. And the idea was they'd get the agricultural produce and the rice out of southern Vietnam and Cambodia, and they ship it straight off into Europe or the rest of Asia. It's worth a lot of money. 1867, it's really expanding again quite quickly. And meanwhile, in Hanoi, the French repeatedly try and take control of the city, and they fail. They are repelled every time. And in fact, there's a fantastic bit of evidence that remains of this. So this is the north gate of the old citadel. And this is what it used to look like. Today, it looks like this, and you can walk past it. And we've got these great gaping holes. These are the cannonball shots from when the French tried to take Hanoi in 1873. It was never repaired, it was just left, and they are still there today. They took control of this by 1887, really, probably 1885, officially by 1887, and they established French Indochina. By 1942, Saigon is really the commercial operation. The north is not under direct control of the French, the south is. So the south is really the French possession, the north is a protectorate still under the control of the emperor, as is the centre of the country. The north is called Tonkin, the centre is called Annam. 1942, middle of World War II, the Japanese took control, but they allow the Vichy French to keep control. The Japanese just want the rice, essentially, and the rubber. Something that I missed out really is that now we've got the role of America, and the role of America doesn't start where you expect it to start. Actually, the role of America starts in 1873, and the emperor at the time doesn't want the French to take control, and so what he does is he sends an emissary, Bouvines. He sends him to America to try and get support from the Americans to defeat the French. He promises the Americans preferential trade access if they help them defeat the French. The story goes, and we're not quite sure how exactly true this is, the story goes that Bouvines got personal assurances from President Grant. And by the way, President Grant would visit Vietnam in 1879, not long after this. I've been trying to find out any evidence of what he did. If anyone knows, please let me know. But Bouvier is supposed to have got assurances that the Americans would support the Vietnamese. Unfortunately, by the time he gets back home, apparently Congress refused. They turned it down, they said they wouldn't support it. And so the French take control. The role of America becomes a lot more pronounced by the time we get to the Second World War, because now the Americans have sent their secret OSS soldiers to support and train the Viet Minh to defeat the Japanese. We know that FDR, Roosevelt, was actually a big supporter of independence in Southeast Asia. He wanted an independent Philippines, he was supportive of an independent Vietnam. He was a pragmatist, I would say. Had he lived, things could have been very different and the Vietnam War might never have happened. As it happens, he died, President Truman takes over, a very different kind of president, and the Vietnamese do not get the support that they need. And so in September 1945, Ho Chi Minh stands in the square in Hanoi and he takes this exactly from the Declaration of Independence in America. All people are created equal, endowed by their creator, blah, 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 blah. He's pleading to America to say, come on, help us, support us. He's publicly drawing them into this because they're supposed to represent freedom. And that's all the Vietnamese want. 1954, the country is divided. They are told you have to hold elections. In the north we've got Ho Chi Minh and in the south we've got the Catholic Ngo Dinh Diem. The peace agreement says, okay, hold elections and then we'll decide what happens with the country. This guy, Ngo Dinh Diem, he holds the election in the south and he receives more votes than there are people in the whole of southern Vietnam. And so we know he's a total crook. His reputation is he's a total crook. Ho Chi Minh, on the other hand, again, hard to say for sure, but I would say I'm 99.99% confident that this man would have won an election by a landslide. It's enormously popular across the country. And so the whole thing falls apart, and this is when the Americans start to get involved. The Americans had already paid for the entire French operation in Vietnam since 1945. The whole thing. Once France withdraws, America is itching to get back involved. The CIA are involved from 1954. I've got posters in my room as proof of that. And they finally get their opportunity to intervene a bit more strongly when this happens, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically this is the excuse America gives to invade Vietnam. They say that they're attacked in international waters. The huge tragedy is that papers which have been released in the last 10 or 15 years have just categorically proven that this guy, Robert McNamara, the defense secretary at the time, he totally knows it's bullshit. He totally knows that it didn't happen in international waters. In fact, it didn't really happen. And so it was used to create this false narrative. And so, that's my history of Vietnam. Just in summary, I would say there's not one Vietnamese history, right? There are these three distinct groups which separate and then come together again. This An Son site just outside of Ho Chi Minh is incredibly significant as a transition culture between hunter-gatherer people and settled agricultural populations. Marine archaeology is essential because I think that there's got to be so much more under the sea, maybe not even that far out, if we go about 10,000 years or so. The Cham are enormously overlooked, but they're so incredibly diverse, rich in culture and significant.